Hello, I'm Will Yeoman, and welcome to another episode of Pod Street, Writing WA's official podcast. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Natalie D. Napoleon. And I should also say we're sitting right here in the State Library of Western Australia, as we often are. Natalie, welcome to Pod Street.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Okay, wonderful new collection that's just been published, well, September, wasn't it? So congratulations. It's just stunning. It's got so much power, so much rawness, but also so much discipline and so much form. Mm-hmm. And I love those extremes. But first of all, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background? Because I know you spent a bit of time in America as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I started out as a singer-songwriter. And then in my 40s, I decided to do an MA in writing when I was living in the States. And I started out the MA thinking I was going to write the great novel, of course, like everyone does. And I was a new mum at the time. And what happened was I didn't have the headspace or the time, and I was being interrupted by my toddler. And these poems just started pouring out of me. It's like I didn't want to write them. They just started coming out. Like I'd write an essay or read some post-colonial theory and a poem would pop out of me. And that was how I ended up writing the collection First Blood. And the poem First Blood was part of one of my MA assignments for my class. So, but yeah, I have a long tradition of being a singer-songwriter. I started doing that in my 20s. I love Americana music and folk music, so I really kind of go into like storytelling, history, and a lot of that carries through to my work in poetry as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, I should have said this is indeed your second collection, but a lot of what you're talking about, that experience of being a new mother and being a mother, is in this collection as well. And in fact, that's primarily what it's about, isn't it? So now the collection is, to remind myself, If There Is a Butterfly. That's the full title. I thought it was, the poem is That Drinks Tears.
It is.
There we go. If There Is a Butterfly That Drinks Tears. What a beautiful, evocative title.
Thank you. And yeah, why you thought the title was If There Is a Butterfly, because that is what we could fit on the spine when I chose to use my full name, Natalie Damjanovich-Napoleon, instead of the shortened version of my name, Natalie D. Napoleon, which I used when my first book came out. It's kind of funny actually, because my sister said to me, you know, Natalie, you're talking about your Croatian identity and you've been using your anglicised version of your name. And she sent me this article, a Greek-Australian woman had written about reclaiming her identity and using her full Greek name instead of her anglicised. And I was like, okay, sister, next book I'm going to use my full name. So,
but as a consequence, you could only get half the title on the spine.
Exactly.
There are sacrifices to be made. But before we go any further, I just want to talk a little bit about the design of the book. It's quite stunning. Now, this is an imprint of Gazebo Books, isn't it? Tell us a little bit more, because obviously this is a podcast and people can't see what we're talking about.
Yeah, so Phil Day is an artist, but he's a visual artist, a painter, and he's got a long history of having published poetry as well. So, you know, again, there's a nice crossover between Phil's work and mine, because I'm a poet who likes to play with visual form as well. And yeah, Phil does this imprint. His painting is on the cover. On the cover of If There's a Butterfly That Drinks Tears is a gorgeous painting of a cabbage moth. And the cover goes from the front to the back is the whole image, and it's called Thing Number 9. And then also with the design of the book, there are no page numbers. Phil's designed it to be read like an old traditional scroll, so that you would have a beautiful flow in reading the poems.
Well, look, that's interesting. That leads us into some of the poems in here. That the way you use space, and what's that one where it does the word spill downwards? Let's see if I can find this. Oh, this is it. This is the first one.
Oh, yes.
The image of a mother holding her baby, gazing into the child's eyes while a notebook and pen rest on a coffee table nearby. 2011. That is the title, by the way, not part of the poem. And then you've got this extraordinary, I think are interruptions, and this loss of control and loss of form. And it just gets more and more dispersed, doesn't it? Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
So really, when I'm doing work like this, and Phil and I talked about this, he really presented my vision in a great way, because often a publisher will not allow you to push words right to the edge of the paper. I think there's some publishing conventions that you're meant to leave a margin.
Indeed.
So, but Phil actually pushed a lot of words, like the word longing in this poem is almost like 1 or 2 spaces from the edge. And that's what I love about that, is that's representing what motherhood is like. It's pushing the boundaries of everything you expect, of what children do. They're always doing the unexpected. You're always on your toes. It's a liminal space that we belong in, that all these boundaries are being pushed through that process, and that I wanted to represent on the page with the words in this collection.
Fantastic. So it is as much a visual as an oral experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there, this is a really difficult question, probably the hardest question I'm going to ask you, which is there a single poem that somehow almost encapsulates the collection that you could actually read for us?
Oh, I'd always have to go to the title poem. It really is the linchpin poem of the collection. So.
Well, let's hear it then, and then that way we can also hear how you actually perform something that is so visual as well, in that respect.
Absolutely. If there is a butterfly that drinks tears. If there is a butterfly that drinks tears, let it drink the tears of mothers. Down south, great walls begin to spring up between butterfly preserves at the speed ice sheets break off in Antarctica. Monarchs fight to find a place to overwinter. Target holes in their wings, a ragged curtain left hanging in a house too long. If I step off this path and crush a butterfly underfoot, will my misstep ripple through time? On the siding of our cottage, my 4-year-old spies a chrysalis. In the high overhead light, we observe the translucent veil between 2 worlds. A pulse of a heartbeat, the stained glass window outline of wings. There are oohs and ahs. With 2 sticks in hand, my son plays crocodile and whacks the chrysalis, splitting it from the cremaster. I scream, "No!" Insides turn to liquid. The turtle does not turn her head. She plods on, a map of the Milky Way carved onto the shell she carries on her back. If there is a butterfly that drinks tears, let it drink the tears of children who do not understand their mother's anger. I pick up the chrysalis from the ground, set it on a warm ledge and hope for the best. I try to explain action and consequence to my 4-year-old, but to him there is only the action and reaction of an impassive, amoral toddler dictator. The caterpillar digests itself, turns to liquid inside the chrysalis before it's made into a butterfly. In that soup there are cells that survive this process, imaginal discs. These cells hold on to a memory of what they are to become. How do we remember who we're meant to be? A sip of salt, imaginal discs, a scatter of minerals, infinitesimal elements in a stew that keeps us alive. In the Amazon, Julia butterflies drink the tears of turtles, the sweat of animals, humans, and given the chance, crocodile tears too.
That's really lovely. Like so many of the other poems in the book, the metaphors, the imagery is very, very strong. And it's quite complex, isn't it, the way you can just switch registers in a way too. And I love that sort of, little take on butterflies' wings,
Mm-hmm.
I sense a lot of empathy too with non-human life in a lot of the poems. You talk about other creatures very compassionately, very empathetically. Do you indeed empathise with them as someone who is a human being, but also a mother?
I've just always drawn so much comfort from nature. And in my first poetry collection, First Blood, it was a memoir of me growing up on a farm. I was raised in a market garden by my Croatian immigrant parents, and we spent a lot of time playing in the bush as kids. And I just think when you have that experience as a child, playing in the bush, observing spider orchids, seeing snakes and bobtail goannas wandering everywhere, you just we had frogs in Thompson's Lake nearby. And I just, as a child, I developed this absolute love of nature. And then, yes, when you are a mother, I mean, I read this, you get this flood of these hormones, which are the love hormones. And I think I got it up, the ante was upped as far as that went. One of the poems, you're probably recalling the one where I was breastfeeding my son, and in our bedroom I actually looked up and there was a daddy longlegs
That
mama.
is exactly the one I was thinking about, yes.
Yeah, there was a daddy longlegs mama with a whole, she must have had hundreds of babies there. And I actually felt, and I'd never had this experience before, I actually felt compassion for spiders and the spider mama and how she wanted to protect her spider babies. And it was a physical, visceral response that I had.
And is that something that stays with you? Maybe not to that extreme, but do you still retain that sense of empathy and compassion with things like spiders, for example?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, as a bit of a backstory to that, my dad would never let us kill spiders, and he'd always make us capture them with a glass and put them outside the house.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm the same with spiders, but also even with cockroaches and flies. Yeah. Believe it or not, I'd rather try and give them a chance first, and then if all else fails, then they have to die, but very compassionately, just quick.
Yes.
So, again, there's a lot of diversity in the collection. How do you... the process of writing, I've talked to other poets about this too, where you either come at it where you have the form and heuristically it generates ideas, or you have the idea or the emotion or the image, and then you say, okay, what's going to suit this? Or maybe there's a third way actually where it just evolves organically one way or another. How do you generally work?
Are you talking about whether I choose to write a kind of fragmented erasure poem, or whether I choose to write a ghazal?
Exactly. What governs those choices?
I guess for me it's probably a wealth of experience. I've been reading and writing poetry for a good decade now, and of course I read it in high school and at university doing my BA as well. And I think now I just kind of know what form to use, or I will try free verse and it's not working, and then I go, no, this idea needs structure. So there's a poem, for example, in the collection called In Motherhood, A Kind of Madness, and I wanted to get this idea of this push and pull of motherhood and how you interrupt it all the time, and it kind of does create some kind of losing of your sense of self and your sanity in the process. And I had written a few pantoums before, and I really love the form. It's cyclical. The first and third line of the first verse become the second and fourth line of the next, and so on. And so you can read a pantoum and not know it's repetitive. People don't quite click to it because it's not an obvious repetition, but it's a really fun form. And with these poems, I'll work on them for days. They're like little jigsaws, deleting lines, putting new ones in, working what works in repetition. And so, yeah, that's how I approach that. Give it a go. If it doesn't work, try form. If that form's not working, try something else. And, I don't belabor things. If it doesn't work after 2 or 3 goes, you start on a new idea.
Look, absolutely. I think that's a very workmanlike approach almost. It's something as a craftsperson you would approach your work. It's just, you're very practical about it, aren't you, in that respect? Yeah,
I do. I have this kind of really interesting brain. Someone pointed this out to me years ago, where I am very practical and analytical and rational, yet also super innovative and creative and willing to push the boundaries of what I think we see as poetry, or what we see as what we can do with words and what we can do with appropriation of others' words as well, through the erasure poetry that I do as well.
That interests me because it took me straight back to the fragments of Sappho, for example, where all we have are the fragments, and you often see them published like that too, where there are all those gaps in meaning. And what I loved about your work too is that it leaves space for that, for you to create your own meaning as a reader as well.
Yeah, that's what I love about erasures and Sappho's fragments and Anne Carson's translation, If Not
beautiful.
Winter,
yes,
was one of the backgrounding inspirations for this collection as well.
Wow.
So well picked up. And also for me, I like hearkening to Sappho and writing these fragmented, erasure poems too, because I think it reaches back to say there is a history of women's writing, and here is this history of our writing, and my writing reaches back to Sappho.
And so much of that has been erased as well.
Exactly, and that's kind of what I want to speak to as well, the unspoken, the unvoiced, the unheard.
Indeed, and there's also that romantic tradition around ruins, isn't there, and fragments. It was quite the thing, and particularly in the 19th century, wasn't it? So it's almost I don't know, it's a kind of, it's weird to say a perfect fragment, isn't it, or a perfect ruin, but there you have it.
Yeah, we do love looking at ruins of things and pieces of things, and what erasure and fragmented poetry allow us is what you talked about earlier, to either fill in the gaps ourselves or just accept those spaces as there are some things we can't say.
Absolutely. Actually, it just reminded me, I read there's a marvellous book on ruins by Susan Stewart, the poet, and she talks about the meaning of the word ruin, and one often talks about a ruined woman as well, don't they? Which is a completely different meaning, but also kind of strangely opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I mean, I don't have any ruined women in this collection.
I'm not suggesting that.
But I love the idea of it, and I make no judgment of ruined women, and we don't call them that anymore.
Exactly,
so.
we don't.
Yeah.
She's just going through the etymology and the history and the usage of the word.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you too, as a musician, I've certainly noticed there's a musicality here, particularly with the variation in rhythm and so forth, and you're very. I think you're very careful about the use of rhyme. You don't tend to overdo it, but are you someone who really is attuned to the music of words as much as music?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that inspired me to really connect with the music of words was when I worked at the Writing Centre in the States. One of the techniques we use with students when tutoring them on their work is we would get them to read their paper aloud. And through doing that work with students one-on-one, it was transformative to my own work. And I started reading everything I wrote out loud, and my writing improved exponentially. And then, of course, Ada Limon in the States, who, before she was US Poet Laureate, a friend in the Writing Centre who is also a poet, handed me her work and said, "You have so much in common with Ada Limon, you need to read her." And then, of course, I read an interview where Ada Limon says all she does while she's composing poems is read aloud, read aloud, read aloud. And then again, being a musician, I do have this great attunement to rhythm. Don't ask me to tell you if something's in Shakespearean iambic pentameter or whatever pentameter is.
So you have an instinctive, an intuitive, natural sort of feel for rhythm. Presumably.
I do, and what you've picked up on is you've noticed there's some half rhymes in there.
Yes.
So, and I love, and again, I've gained a really great appreciation of rappers and rap music and spoken word that use a lot of half rhyme. So that's where the middle sound of a word, not the end sound, might rhyme. So, a middle vowel sound, and then instead of ending with a hard T, it ends with a P or something like that. So you're hearing a little bit of a rhyme, but not the full kind of rhymey thing, which we don't like now because we think it kind of sounds nursery rhyme-like. So we like to, in modern poetry, do free verse and just sometimes hint at a little bit of rhyme.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because does that mean we don't appreciate earlier poetry as much anymore? If I take an example, someone like Dylan Thomas, who the sound is just almost too loud for us nowadays, and he's not 19th century, he's only going back a few decades, surely. Does that mean we can't tolerate that kind of poetry to that extent anymore because our ears have become so accustomed to the sound?
I don't think so. I just think that maybe popular song has taken over the place that rhyming poetry had way back. And so I think poetry found another place to belong, or found its own space for itself that wasn't as focused on rhyme. But it is interesting, when I teach poetry classes, the students do still love to rhyme, even if we say it's a free verse class, and if you want to write rhyming poetry, this is not the class for you. So they still want to rhyme. So I think it's an instinct, a human instinct.
Yeah, and if you're teaching someone, do you feel that it's important that nevertheless they should understand how rhyme works and to use it if they want to have rhyming couplets or something like that? That's okay because it's part of the process of becoming a poet.
Yeah, I have said to my students, if that's what calls to them, go for it. I am one of those people that, and again, this is the thing I learnt in the States, that everyone has a different process and everyone has different forms that call to them. So if rhyming calls to you, go for it. But I have also added a proviso to that, which is there's not a lot of rhymed poetry being published today. So, and to do rhymed poetry, you have to do it well. And what happens when students rhyme is they choose the most obvious rhyme, cat, hat, mat, right? and they don't push the boundaries and choose something a little different that's, going past the...
So if you did it well, though, do you think that it's actually a radical act then to write a sonnet that rhymes? Because no one else is doing it, and it's completely radical.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, Terence Hayes wrote a collection that was all sonnets to my past and future assassins, so in the States. So, there's people. I just say, whatever you want to do, whatever inspires you, go for it. See what works.
So you mentioned a couple of influences already. What about other influences, and particularly around the themes you explore? I mean, the obvious example around motherhood is probably some of the Sylvia Plath poems. Were there any people like that writing in this space in particular that influenced you?
Not any modern poets.
No.
Plath's Ariel I had read in between First Blood and writing If There Is a Butterfly. So, of course, and I got the new annotated version of Ariel, so I just read it front to back. Over and over, read all the notes, just absolutely loved them and absorbed that. Actually, one thing that inspired me was a prose book, which was Adrienne Rich's book on motherhood. And she wrote this great, how Adrienne Rich is a great academic as well as a poet. And she wrote this kind of academic and crossing academic and layperson's ideas in a book on motherhood. And that was one of my inspirations as well. So, and then just me wanting to push the boundaries and do something different. I want people to, if there's a butterfly, I want them to look at motherhood like any other epic moment in anybody's life. Like Joseph Campbell writes about the hero's journey. I want people to read about motherhood and think it's an archetypal human experience we should all know about. And then my thing that I was playing with the epic and the tiny and mundane little
the intimate
moments. So it's the epic and the intimate in this collection.
I mean, there are possibly some poems here that some people might find confronting. Was that somewhere in the back of your mind that you would understand that some of these poems would be hard to take by some people, but nevertheless are important to say out loud?
Oh, absolutely. I cover the morning after pill, infertility, miscarriage, phantom pregnancy is one thing, and abortion as well. But part of that is we need to look at, as a society, the whole reality of women and people who live with uteruses, what that means for us in reality. Looking at things in this kind of fantasy idea of Hallmark, Americans would say, a Hallmark card idea of motherhood is not helping anyone. And we need to, that was part of my thinking behind this collection, was addressing a whole bunch of different experiences. I have been through infertility. I've had a miscarriage. I wrote to that. And then some of the other experiences were things that happened to people I knew. So other mums that I knew. But
also, I mean, in quite graphic terms as well. So using, a diction that is very much rooted in bodily function. I mean, that's interesting because, again, that's something that traditionally poetry doesn't address.
Yeah, I often go back to, when anyone asks me about this question, I go back to my singer-songwriter background. Lucinda Williams wrote this song called Passionate Kisses, and she really struggled. She's for people who don't know, country/Americana singer-songwriter. She tried to get the song recorded in Nashville, and then her quote was, Nashville don't like buddy parts, So, but it's kind of the same thing. I am, Bron Bateman, Lisa Collier, Scott Patrick Mitchell. There's a lot of us West Australian writers writing to bodily reality. And look, sometimes we don't want to hear about bodies and all that stuff. But if you want to write about the reality of being a human being and a mother, there's no way of doing it without addressing, baby poo, vomit, blood, all the other things that come with parenthood, raising a child, and motherhood. And if you want to be real about it, there's no other way. From my point of view, there's no other way to approach writing about it.
Okay, so why then does, I guess, ostensibly a decorative form like poetry suit this more than, say, the great realist novel that you perhaps wanted to write?
I agree with you. Yeah, you could definitely write a wonderful realist novel about motherhood or poetry. It just so happened that poetry was easier for me again because I'm a mum and being interrupted, and I have a day job, and I just, for whatever reason, poetry calls to me. Yeah, but I do hope to write a novel one day.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I'm still sitting on that. The ideas are bubbling there, so I'll never say never.
Would you consider just stepping into maybe the short story form first to try and bridge those two and experimenting?
Maybe. I did try and write short stories when I was younger, and they are a really good way to get into writing longer pieces. And I am a big fan of George Saunders, and I bought his wonderful book because he's really big in the States. That wonderful book, what was it, about the rain, and he wrote about all the Russian short story writers, A Short Walk in the Rain, or someone's going to write in and correct my...
I know, look, I should know because I've read it, but I can't remember it. Isn't it dreadful? He's got a great Substack as well. I'm really finding Substack so interesting for those short form or even long form essays.
Yeah, I have heard about that, but at the moment I'm finishing my PhD.
Fair enough.
I haven't got time to delve into any wonderful Substacks that I've been hearing about and reading about. So, but when I'm finished...
just make sure you make a list so that when you're ready, you know where to go.
Yeah. But yes, short story form, reading George Saunders' book was really inspiring to me. So yeah, maybe, possibly. Or maybe I'll just dive into writing a novel.
Why not? So look, I mean, at this point towards the end, I often like to ask people if they've got any advice for aspiring, in this case, poets, writers. You've already actually given us heaps of advice. Is there anything more specific you'd like to impart to our listeners?
Oh, so read aloud.
Yes.
And read poets. If you're going to write poetry, you need to read a lot of poetry. And I know it seems obvious, but I've done a few poetry competitions, judged them and things like that, and you can tell that people haven't read a lot of contemporary poetry if they're submitting work. It's very fresh and kind of naive, and so read aloud, read a lot of poetry. Just go to your local library. Anyone, any good librarian can recommend a bunch of stuff. Go to local poetry readings. In Santa Barbara, before I started writing poetry, I went to a whole bunch of poetry readings. I never read. I just sat back and listened to all these wonderful poets reading. And yeah, it's another great way to get into it.
Well, it's come to the end of our time here on Pod Street. Natalie Napoleon, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Will. It's been lovely. Thank you.